Tendai watched Kofi devour his pastry, the child's small fingers dusted in powdered sugar, blissfully unaware of the tension gripping his uncle. Tendai stirred his coffee, lost in thought as he gazed out the window of the quaint cafe. The morning sun filtered through the glass, painting everything in a warm, honeyed light that felt almost too peaceful given the storm brewing inside him. His mind reeled from the morning's events, the unexpected reappearance of Zuri, and the haunting weight that lingered in her eyes. He had barely taken a sip of his coffee when he sensed someone approaching. His body tensed. Tendai looked up, and there she was, Zuri. She wore a hesitant smile, the corners of her lips turned up in a way that seemed forced, as if she were walking into a battlefield rather than a cafe. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, her voice light, though her eyes betrayed the swirling undercurrent of emotions she was trying to hide. Tendai nodded stiffly. "It's open." She slid into the chair across from him, folding her hands on the table. The air between them grew thick, as if the very molecules were charged with unresolved tension, pressing down on them both. Zuri cleared her throat, glancing briefly at Kofi, who was now focused on his hot chocolate, blissfully unaware of the emotional minefield surrounding him. They sat in silence for a moment before Zuri finally spoke, her voice soft. "I didn't think I'd be back here so soon." The words hung in the air like a confession. Tendai's jaw clenched as he fought to control the rush of emotions stirring within him. "Funny, I thought you left for good." Her gaze dropped to her hands, fingers trembling slightly. "I thought I had, too." There was a strange sadness in her voice, a rawness that Tendai wasn't used to hearing from her. Zuri was always the composed one, the girl who met every challenge with grace, never allowing her true feelings to show. But now that veneer was cracking and he could see the fragile woman beneath. Tendai took a slow breath, his tone colder than he intended. "So what brings you back? Couldn't stay away from all this small-town charm." Zuri's eyes shot up, piercing him with a look that was equal parts defiance and regret. "You have no idea," she said, her voice laced with an edge that sent a jolt through him. "You think it was easy for me to leave? That I just walked away without a second thought?" He was caught off guard, but he held her gaze. "It sure seemed like it. One day you were here, the next ... gone." Zuri's shoulders slumped, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "I didn't want to leave," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But I had to." Tendai was about to respond when Kofi interrupted, holding up his sticky fingers proudly. "Look, Uncle Tendai." I made a smiley face with the chocolate. The innocence in Kofi's voice broke the tension, and both adults couldn't help but smile, though it was tinged with sadness. Zuri's gaze softened as she looked at Kofi, a faint glimmer of warmth breaking through her hardened exterior. The moment passed quickly, and the walls went back up, but Tendai had seen it, a flicker of something real, something vulnerable. When Kofi was occupied again, Zuri's attention shifted back to Tendai. Her eyes were shadowed, but there was a new resolve in her voice. "There's more you don't know, Tendai. Things I couldn't tell you then." He arched an eyebrow, trying to keep his tone even. "So tell me now." Zuri hesitated, biting her lip. For a moment he thought she might back out, but then she leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "I wasn't just leaving, I was ... running." From what Tendai's question was sharper than he intended. Zuri's eyes darted around the cafe, as if checking for invisible onlookers. Her voice trembled. "From someone. From something I did." She stopped herself, inhaling deeply as she looked at him. "I was in deep, Tendai. Deeper than I ever let on. I thought I could keep it from you, that I could keep you safe by staying away." Tendai felt his pulse quicken, the pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed falling into place. Safe from what, Zuri? She looked away, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "From my past. From a man I thought I knew, someone I thought cared for me." Her voice wavered. "But I got it wrong." "So wrong." Tendai's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "What happened?" Zuri swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He made me believe he was someone he wasn't. He had power, influence, connections. I got involved without understanding who he really was. By the time I realized, it was too late. I was already in over my head. The confession hit Tendai like a punch. He had always suspected Zuri held secrets, but this was more than he'd ever imagined. A chill crept down his spine. "Zuri, are you saying you were ... in danger?" She nodded, her expression pained. "It got dangerous fast. I thought I could handle it on my own, but things spiraled. The people he was connected to, they were ruthless. And when I tried to get out, to leave him, he ... didn't take it well. Leaving him wasn't an option." Tendai's mind raced as he processed her words. "So that's why you left? To protect yourself?" Her gaze softened, her vulnerability laid bare. "And to protect you. He knew about you, Tendai. I didn't realize it until it was too late, but he would have come for you if he thought it would keep me in line." The gravity of her words settled over him, a cold realization sinking in. Tendai's heart ached with a mixture of anger and regret. All this time he'd resented her for leaving, never understanding the sacrifice she'd made. She had walked away, not out of indifference, but out of desperation to shield him from a danger he never even knew existed. "So why come back now?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Zuri's eyes met his, filled with a blend of determination and fear. "Because he's gone now. I stayed away until I knew for certain. He had some enemies of his own. They got to him before he could get to us." Tendai felt a jolt of shock, the weight of her revelation hitting him like a tidal wave. She had returned because she was free, finally free of the chains that had bound her to a dangerous past. The irony was bitter all this time. He'd resented her for leaving, while she had been fighting a battle he never even knew about. Zuri reached across the table, her hand hovering just above his. "I came back because I couldn't stay away any longer. Because I knew it was finally safe for all of us. But I understand if she trailed off," her voice trembling as she pulled her hand back. "If you can't forgive me." Tendai's heart pounded, a torrent of emotions swirling within him. Anger, regret, and something else, something warm. A rekindling of the love he had buried beneath layers of resentment. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers in a silent gesture of understanding. "It's not about forgiveness," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's about moving forward. Together, if that's still something you want." A tear slipped down Zuri's cheek, and she nodded, her fingers tightening around his. In that moment they both felt a weight lift, a glimmer of hope breaking through the darkness that had shadowed their lives. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but for the first time they felt a flicker of something real, something worth fighting for. As Kofi finished his hot chocolate, oblivious to the silent promises exchanged between the two adults, Tendai and Zuri knew that their journey was far from over. But for the first time they faced it together, bound by the scars of the past and the hope of a new beginning. The air was crisp with the early afternoon breeze as Tendai, Zuri, and Kofi strolled into the park. It had been years since Tendai had come here, but everything felt strangely familiar: the ancient oak trees, the winding paths, the smell of freshly cut grass. They walked quietly, each lost in their own thoughts, Kofi's small hand nestled in his uncle's as he hopped along the path, oblivious to the tension simmering between the adults. They found a quiet spot under a willow tree, its branches hanging low, offering them a secluded space away from the bustle of the park. Kofi quickly darted to a nearby patch of wildflowers, picking one and examining it closely, his curiosity once again distracting him from the charged silence. Tendai and Zuri sat on a weathered wooden bench, each hesitant to break the quiet. The weight of the morning's revelations still lingered between them, but something unspoken pulsed in the air, a sense that more needed to be unearthed. The leaves rustled overhead, casting dappled sunlight across their faces, a quiet reminder of the days they'd once spent here together. Tendai cleared his throat, glancing at her. "This place hasn't changed a bit," he said, his voice almost nostalgic. Zuri smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. No, it hasn't, she hesitated, her gaze drifting over to where Kofi was playing, twirling the flower in his small hands. Her expression softened, but Tendai could see a flicker of something else in her eyes, a shadow of pain. You used to love coming here, he murmured, leaning back, hoping his casual tone would coax her to open up. We'd walk for hours, just talking. It felt like nothing could touch us then. Zuri's smile faded, and her shoulders tensed. Those were better times. The words were heavy with regret, and Tendai turned to her, trying to read the expression on her face. She looked different here, more vulnerable, like the weight of her secrets had finally begun to lift. And then, before he could ask, she closed her eyes, a shaky breath slipping from her lips. It's strange, she began softly, to come back to a place that once held so much happiness and realize that happiness was fleeting. Tendai's brow furrowed, the longing in her voice pulling at something deep inside him. What do you mean? Zuri opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze piercing. There's more to my story, Tendai. More than just the man I left to escape. Coming back here, it brings it all back. The things I tried to forget. The choices I made. He felt his heart quicken, sensing the intensity behind her words. But before he could ask further, she looked away, her eyes focused on Kofi, who was now running along the edge of the grass, his laughter ringing through the air. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I was so naive, she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. When I left you, it wasn't just because of him. There was something else. Someone else. Tendai's stomach tightened. Someone else, the words left his lips before he could stop them, but the hurt in his voice was unmistakable. Zuri nodded slowly, a shadow passing over her face. His name was Malik. I met him shortly after. After I left, he was like no one I'd ever known. Charming, successful, always knew the right things to say, but there was something about him that made me feel like I had to prove myself. Like I wasn't enough as I was. I thought he was the answer to the emptiness I felt after walking away from you. Tendai swallowed, his hands curling into fists. And what happened with Malik? Zuri's voice grew quiet. He wasn't who I thought he was. He wasn't. Anyone's answer, she shivered, pulling her coat closer around her shoulders. Malik pulled me into a world I wasn't ready for. I was just some naive girl in love with a fantasy, and that's what he gave me, a fantasy carefully woven with lies. But I didn't see it. Not until it was too late. Tendai could feel the anger rising in his chest, though he wasn't sure if it was directed at Malik, at Zuri, or at himself for never knowing. What kind of lies, he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Zuri looked away, her eyes distant. Everything about him was a lie, Tendai. He had this whole operation, a network of people who dealt in things I can't even talk about. But to me, he was just Malik, the man I thought I loved. By the time I realized the truth, I was trapped. He didn't let me leave, not without a price. Tendai's hand clenched around the edge of the bench, his mind reeling. He'd imagined her life without him as peaceful, perhaps even happy. This dark world she was describing felt like a nightmare. So, that's why you stayed away. Zuri's gaze softened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep everything separate. But it got complicated. He started to use my past against me, the things I'd told him in confidence, even things about you. She closed her eyes, pain twisting her face. He threatened to hurt you if I left him. Tendai's blood ran cold. The weight of her confession settled heavily on him, and he struggled to breathe through the anger and disbelief churning inside him. He had spent years wondering what had driven her away, never imagining it was this tangled web of deceit and danger. Why didn't you tell me, he demanded, his voice thick with emotion. Zuri's hands twisted together in her lap, her gaze fixed on the ground. Because I knew you'd try to save me. I knew you'd get involved, and I couldn't let that happen. You and Kofi were the only good things left in my life. I couldn't risk bringing you into his world. I couldn't let you get hurt. They sat in silence for a moment, the distant laughter of children and the rustling of leaves the only sounds around them. Tendai looked at her, his anger melting into a painful sympathy as he saw the toll this had taken on her. The woman before him was a shadow of the girl he'd once known, someone who had been scarred by secrets she'd kept hidden too long. "I never wanted to leave you, Tendai," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I thought I was protecting you, but it broke me in ways I can't even explain. And even after he was gone, I didn't know how to come back." The vulnerability in her voice struck him like a blow. She was baring her soul, showing him the pain and regret she had carried alone. He reached over, his hand finding hers, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." She looked at him, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't know if I can start over, Tendai. I'm damaged. I feel like a stranger to myself. I don't even know who I am anymore." He leaned in, his voice steady. "You're Zuri. And whatever you went through, whatever you had to do to survive, it doesn't change that. We'll face it together." Zuri closed her eyes, the tension in her face finally easing as she squeezed his hand back. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean into the warmth of his presence, feeling the weight of her secrets lift, even if only slightly. They sat in silence, a quiet peace settling between them, though Tendai's mind was racing. Malik, the name alone filled him with dread, and he knew he needed to understand more about what had truly happened during those years. But for now, with Zuri at his side and Kofi's laughter filling the air, he allowed himself to simply be in the moment. Then as they sat there, Zuri broke the silence, her voice barely audible but unmistakably raw. "There's something else, Tendai." He turned to her, frowning. "What is it?" Zuri took a breath, steadying herself. "I wasn't just protecting you from him," she looked up, her gaze intense. "I was protecting something else. Malik left me with more than scars. He left me with something precious, something I had to hide, even from you." Tendai's heart pounded as he tried to process her words. She reached into her bag, pulling out an old, weathered photograph, a picture of a young boy, no older than Kofi, with bright, curious eyes that seemed to hold a world of secrets. "This is my son," Zuri whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He's Malik's, but he's also mine." The world around them seemed to fade as Tendai stared at the photograph, the shock coursing through him. His mind reeled, his heart caught between anger, disbelief, and a strange sense of understanding. The woman he loved had endured horrors beyond his imagination, but she had also carried a piece of Malik, a piece that was innocent, a piece that Zuri had fought to protect at all costs. Tendai looked up at her, his own voice barely a whisper. "Zuri, why didn't you tell me?" Her gaze softened, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his face. "Because I was afraid of losing you all over again. But I couldn't stay away. I had to come back for him. And for you." Tendai swallowed, feeling a surge of emotion that he couldn't contain. As they sat there, surrounded by the laughter of children and the rustling of leaves, he realized that this revelation, this boy, was not just Yuri's burden. It was a chance, fragile and full of promise, to rebuild the life they had lost. The salty tang of the ocean air hit Tendai's face as he stood on the rocky beach, the waves crashing at his feet. He glanced back at Zuri, who stood a few paces behind him, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to shield her heart from the cold wind and the truth she was about to reveal. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand, and for a brief moment everything was quiet except for the sound of the ocean, a vast, relentless force echoing the turmoil within them both. Kofi was safely back at home, watched over by a neighbor who didn't ask questions when Tendai had quickly explained they needed some time alone. Now, as he looked at Zuri, he realized he was seeing her in a new light. She was as beautiful as ever, her dark curls swept back by the wind, her eyes filled with 1,000 unspoken words. But beneath that beauty was a fragility, a weight of sorrow he was only beginning to understand. Zuri took a deep breath, and he could tell she was steeling herself. When she met his gaze, her eyes were haunted, a storm of emotions swirling just beneath the surface. She took a step closer, her voice barely more than a whisper. I brought you here because I need to tell you everything she said. I need you to understand. Tendai's chest tightened as he nodded. I'm listening, Zuri. She turned her gaze to the horizon, the colors of the setting sun reflected in her eyes. You know about Malik, about the lies and the danger he brought into my life. But there's a part one left out. The part one was too ashamed to tell you. Tendai held his breath, sensing that whatever she was about to say would change everything. What is it? She hesitated, her voice breaking. Malik wasn't just dangerous. He was controlling. He didn't let me out of his sight, not even for a moment. When I first tried to leave him, he did something that still haunts me. She closed her eyes, as if reliving the pain. He took me somewhere far from everyone, and he made sure I couldn't reach out to anyone. Not to you, not to my family, no one. Tendai felt his fists clench involuntarily. The image of Zuri, trapped and alone, twisted his stomach with anger and helplessness. Where did he take you? Her voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the roar of the waves. A remote cabin, miles from any town. There were people who worked for him, who made sure I didn't leave. I was kept there, Tendai, for months. No contact, no freedom. Just him and his people. Tendai took a step back, the enormity of her words settling over him like a heavy shroud. He couldn't even imagine the fear and isolation she must have felt. Why didn't you tell me this before? Zuri's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Because I thought it would change the way you see me, that you'd see me as broken, as damaged. Tendai felt his heart ache, but he reached out, his hand gently brushing hers. You're not damaged, Zuri. You're stronger than anyone I know. She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. It's not just that, Tendai. There's something else. Something that happened while I was there. Her voice wavered, and Tendai could feel her reluctance, the weight of the secret she was struggling to reveal. What happened? He asked softly, not wanting to push her but desperate to understand. Zuri looked away, staring out at the ocean, as if the vastness of the sea could somehow make her pain smaller, easier to bear. One night, after I tried to escape, Malik punished me. He made sure I'd never try to run again. Her voice broke, and Tendai's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her tone. And it was that night that I became pregnant with his son. The words hit Tendai like a physical blow, the revelation twisting his insides. He felt his heart pound, a mix of emotions flooding through him: anger, sorrow, and a profound sense of helplessness. Zuri's son wasn't just a remnant of her past with Malik. He was a reminder of a night filled with terror, of a life stolen from her. Tendai struggled to find his voice. You went through that alone. Zuri nodded, her eyes filled with pain. I had no choice. Malik kept me under his control until I gave birth. He threatened to take my son from me, to hide him away if I didn't comply with his demands. I was trapped, Tendai. Every day I lived in fear that he would hurt my child. So I stayed silent. I obeyed. And the day I finally escaped was the day I vowed I'd never let that man have power over me again. Tendai reached for her hand, his own trembling with the weight of her confession. You were protecting him, he whispered, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. She nodded, her expression fierce. I would do anything to protect him. And to protect you, she looked down at their intertwined fingers, her voice a broken whisper. That's why I stayed away. Because I knew that Malik's influence reached far beyond me. He had connections, people who would hurt you if they thought I was a threat. Tendai's mind spun, his heart torn between rage and an overwhelming desire to hold her, to shield her from everything she had suffered. He tightened his grip on her hand, feeling the cold wind whip around them, but ignoring it. Zuri, you don't have to do this alone anymore. I'm here, we'll protect him together. But she pulled her hand away, her eyes filled with a deep sorrow. It's not that simple, Tendai. Even though Malik is gone, his legacy, his shadows, they linger. There are still people who would see me as a threat, people who would see my son as a bargaining chip. Tendai's jaw clenched. Then let them come. I won't let anyone hurt you or him. Not anymore. Zuri smiled faintly, a mix of gratitude and sadness in her expression. You always did believe you could save me, Tendai. But this is not a battle that can be won with strength alone. He stepped closer, the intensity of his feelings for her making his voice rough. Then how, Zuri? Tell me. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll fight anyone, go anywhere, if it means giving you a chance at happiness. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a love that was shadowed by years of pain and fear. I know you would, she said softly, but it's not just me I'm worried about. My son. He deserves a life where he's not haunted by Malik's memory, where he's not tied to his father's crimes. Tendai's heart ached at the thought of a child caught in the web of his father's darkness. He took a deep breath, his voice firm. We'll find a way, Zuri, together. I don't care what it takes, I don't care how dangerous it is. I'm not letting you go through this alone anymore. She looked at him, her expression softening as if his words were a balm to wounds that had been opened far too long. And in that moment, as the last rays of the setting sun cast a golden glow over them, something shifted between them. The walls she had built around herself began to crumble, and she allowed herself to lean into him, resting her head on his shoulder, finding comfort in his warmth. I missed you, she whispered, her voice filled with a raw honesty that left Tendai breathless. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly as if to anchor her to him, to remind her that she wasn't alone. I missed you too, Zuri, more than you'll ever know. They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, letting the sound of the waves wash over them, carrying away some of the pain and fear that had weighed them down. For a moment everything felt right, as if they were finally finding their way back to each other after years of wandering in darkness. But just as Tendai began to believe they might have a chance, Zuri stiffened in his arms, pulling back. Her eyes darted to the shoreline, her body tensing as if she'd seen a ghost. What's wrong? Tendai asked, alarmed by the sudden shift. Zuri's face was pale, her gaze fixed on a figure in the distance, a man standing near the edge of the water, his silhouette partially hidden in the shadows. Tendai squinted, trying to make out the stranger's features, but the fading light obscured his face. It's him, Zuri whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the waves. Tendai's heart stopped. Malik? I thought you said he was dead. Zuri shook her head, her voice trembling. I thought he was. But that's him, Tendai. I'd know that figure anywhere. A cold dread settled over Tendai as he watched the figure. The man's stance was relaxed, casual, as if he had all the time in the world. Tendai's instinct screamed at him to get Zuri away from here, to protect her, but he knew she wouldn't leave without confronting this nightmare that had haunted her. He took her hand, squeezing it tightly. We'll face him together. You're not alone anymore, Zuri. She looked up at him, her fear mingling with determination. No, I'm not. As the figure started moving closer, Tendai braced himself, knowing that the battle ahead would test them both in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But as he looked at Zuri, he knew they would face it together, bound by a love that had survived years of darkness and pain. And no matter what Malik or anyone else threw their way, Tendai was ready to fight for their future, for the life they had both dreamed of but never dared to hope for. The waves crashed around them, fierce and unrelenting, as they prepared to face the past and finally to reclaim their lives from the shadows. The cliff was rugged and wild, the wind whipping around them with a raw intensity that matched the emotions swirling between them. Tendai and Zuri stood side by side, gazing out over the edge, where the waves crashed furiously against the rocks below. The vastness of the ocean stretched before them, endless and daunting, but there was a strange calm here, an undeniable sense that this was where they needed to be. Zuri's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she could lose herself in its endless expanse. Tendai could see her resolve wavering, her shoulders tense, as though carrying a weight too heavy to bear. He reached out, taking her hand in his, feeling the chill of her skin against his warmth. She looked up at him, and he saw it, the deep-rooted fear, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. "Zuri," he began softly, his voice steady, "you don't have to carry this alone anymore." She bit her lip, glancing away. "I wish it were that simple, Tendai. I'm not the same person I was when we met. There's too much darkness now. Too much that I can't erase." Tendai shook his head, his grip on her hand tightening. "I don't care about the darkness, Zuri. I care about you." He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Whatever happened in the past, whatever you think makes you unworthy of happiness, it doesn't change how I feel. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." A shiver ran through her, and she took a shaky breath. "I can't promise you a life free from shadows, Tendai. I can't promise that everything will be okay." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "Then don't promise me that. Promise me this instead. Promise that we'll face those shadows together. Whatever comes, we won't let it tear us apart." Her eyes glistened, a tear slipping down her cheek as she gazed at him, searching his face for reassurance. "Do you mean that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Even after everything I've told you?" He nodded, his voice firm. "Yes, even after everything." He lifted her hand, pressing it to his heart. "You have a piece of me, Zuri, and nothing, no one can take that away. I'm not letting you go again." For a moment her expression softened, the guarded look in her eyes melting away as she allowed herself to believe in him, to trust in the strength of his promise. She stepped closer, resting her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, anchoring her to him, as if to shield her from the world. But just as she began to relax, a new tension flickered across her face, and she pulled back slightly, a shadow returning to her eyes. "There's something else, Tendai," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the cliffs below. He frowned, his heart pounding. "What is it?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "There's someone else who knows about my son, someone who has a claim to him." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, a claim?" Zuri's voice trembled as she continued. "It's Malik's family, his brother. He's trying to take my son away from me. He thinks he has a right to raise him, to mold him into Malik's image. He sees my son as a legacy." Tendai felt his pulse quicken, a surge of protectiveness overtaking him. "Over my dead body," he said, his voice filled with quiet fury. "No one's going to take your son from you, Zuri, no one." She looked up at him, desperation flickering in her eyes. "He's powerful, Tendai. He has resources, people who could make my life a nightmare. I don't know if I can fight him on my own." "Then you won't fight him alone," he replied fiercely. "We'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe. I'll be with you every step of the way." Zuri's lips parted, her eyes wide as she looked at him, the weight of his words settling over her like a balm to her wounded heart. "You'd really stand by me, even if it means facing Malik's family?" He cupped her face in his hands, his gaze unwavering. "I told you I'm not letting you go. Not now, not ever." He leaned down, his voice a whisper against her skin. "We'll protect him, Zuri. We'll build a life where no one can touch us. I promise you that." In that moment, standing at the edge of the cliff with the world stretching out before them, Zuri allowed herself to believe in his words. She reached up, wrapping her arms around his neck, and kissed him, a kiss filled with both desperation and hope, a silent vow to face the darkness together. As they stood entwined, the ocean crashing below, Tendai knew that this was only the beginning of their fight. But he also knew that together they could face anything, even the shadows that threatened to consume them. And as he held her close, he made a silent vow to himself, no matter the cost, he would protect this family, this fragile love, with everything he had. The countryside stretched before them, a tapestry of rolling hills and golden fields that seemed to promise peace. Tendai drove the old car down the narrow lane, glancing over at Zuri, who sat quietly beside him, her gaze fixed out the window. In the back seat, Kofi was humming a tune to himself, blissfully unaware of the tangled emotions his uncle and Zuri were navigating. They'd planned this retreat as a brief escape from the tension, a chance to reconnect in a place untouched by the weight of their shared past. Tendai had arranged for them to stay in a small, secluded cottage nestled by a crystal-clear lake, surrounded by nothing but nature and silence. He hoped it would give Zuri a chance to relax, to let go of the fear and burden she'd been carrying for so long. When they finally arrived, Kofi jumped out of the car, racing toward the lake, his laughter echoing across the still water. Tendai followed him, watching with a smile as Zuri stepped out of the car, looking around with a tentative expression, as though she were afraid to let herself feel peace. "It's beautiful here," she murmured, her voice soft. Tendai came up beside her. "I thought it might be good to get away from everything. Just us, just for a little while." Zuri nodded, giving him a grateful smile. "Thank you, Tendai. I haven't felt this calm in a long time." As evening fell, they gathered by the lake, a small fire crackling beside them. Kofi was asleep inside, worn out from the day's excitement. The two of them sat in companionable silence, watching the stars begin to peek through the twilight. Tendai couldn't help but feel the weight of everything they'd left unsaid, as if the countryside itself were coaxing secrets from the shadows. "You know, I almost forgot what it feels like to breathe," Zuri whispered, breaking the quiet. Her gaze was fixed on the stars, her expression softened in the warm glow of the fire. "Maybe it's time to let go of some of that weight," Tendai replied gently, reaching over to take her hand. Zuri looked down, her fingers curling around his. "Tendai, there's something I haven't told you about Malik, and why I stayed as long as I did." He looked at her, his heart pounding. "Go on." Zuri took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. "There was a moment when I almost became like him." She looked away, her face filled with shame. "He had a hold on me, not just because of fear, but because he made me believe I could be like him, that I was capable of the same cruelty." Tendai's chest tightened, but he kept his gaze steady. "What happened, Zuri?" "There was a man," she continued, her voice trembling. "He was close to Malik, part of his operation. He tried to get to me, to control me. And one night after Malik had hurt me, this man confronted me, taunting me, daring me to stand up for myself. And in that moment, Tendai," she swallowed hard, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, "I almost did something I would never be able to take back. I almost hurt him in a way that would have changed who I am." Tendai's breath hitched. "But you didn't." Zuri shook her head, her voice choked with emotion. "No, I stopped myself just before it went too far. But the thought, it still haunts me. That darkness, it's inside me, Tendai. No matter how hard I try to escape it." He reached up, gently cupping her face. "That darkness was forced on you, Zuri. But you didn't let it consume you. You chose to walk away. You chose to be here with us. That choice is what defines you, not the shadows someone else cast over your life." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "I want to believe that," she whispered, "but sometimes I'm afraid I'll never be able to shake the memories. That they'll always be there, lurking beneath the surface." Tendai pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as they sat in silence, the warmth of the fire casting soft shadows around them. "You're not alone in this, Zuri. We'll face those memories together. And we'll make new ones, better ones, ones that remind you of the light you still carry." She looked up at him, a glimmer of hope breaking through her sorrow. "Do you really think I can?" He smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I know you can. You've already come so far. And no matter what, I'll be right here, every step of the way." In that moment, Zuri allowed herself to believe in his words, in the strength of their connection. The fire crackled beside them, and the stars shone brighter, as if bearing witness to the promise they'd forged in the quiet of the countryside, a promise of healing, of hope, and of love that could withstand even the deepest scars. As they sat there, bathed in starlight, Tendai felt the first stirrings of a future. He could finally envision one where shadows would always be present, but where they'd find peace in each other's arms, a sanctuary from the darkness of the past. The familiar scent of vanilla and butter filled the kitchen as Tendai poured a fresh batch of pancake batter onto the griddle. It was the same kitchen where he and Zuri had once shared countless breakfasts, and now it felt as if they were finally returning to the heart of something they'd lost. Zuri stood nearby, watching him with a soft smile, a look of calm that hadn't graced her face in years. The morning light spilled through the windows, bathing the room in a warm glow that felt almost sacred. Kofi was upstairs, still fast asleep, allowing the two of them a rare moment alone. "It's strange, isn't it?" Zuri said, her voice quiet. "Being here again. I never thought I'd find peace in this house." Tendai glanced at her, flipping a pancake with a practiced ease. Sometimes the only way to make peace with the past is to return to where it all began. She leaned against the counter, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the cool surface. "When I left, I thought I could run from everything, from the mistakes, from the darkness. But coming back, I'm realizing that those things will always be part of me." Tendai turned off the stove, wiping his hands on a dish towel as he walked over to her. "Maybe it's not about erasing the past. Maybe it's about choosing how it shapes us." Her eyes met his, a spark of hope mingling with the fear that lingered there. "And how do we do that, Tendai? How do we turn all of this pain into something good?" He reached out, taking her hands in his. "By accepting it, by letting it be part of our story instead of something we hide from, and by finding strength in each other, in what we're building together." Zuri looked down at their intertwined fingers, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I never thought I'd find my way back to you. I never thought I'd feel worthy of this." "You're more than worthy, Zuri," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "And I think deep down you've always known that." They stood in silence, the warmth of the kitchen enveloping them, as if it too were welcoming them back. But then a quiet knock on the front door shattered the moment, cutting through the tranquility like a knife. Tendai exchanged a look with Zuri, a hint of apprehension flickering in her gaze. "Are you expecting someone?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He shook his head, his brow furrowing. "No, no one knows we're here, except a few close friends." They both moved toward the door, Tendai positioning himself in front as he reached for the handle. He opened it slowly, his heart pounding, but what he saw on the other side froze him in place. Standing there was a man he didn't recognize, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his gaze cold and calculating. He looked at Zuri, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Zuri," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an unsettling familiarity. "I see you've made yourself at home." Tendai felt Zuri's hand grip his arm, her nails digging into his skin as she took a step back. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with horror. "Jonah," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. The man's smile widened. "I was beginning to think I'd never find you. But here you are, playing house." His gaze flicked to Tendai, a look of disdain flashing across his face. "And with him no less." Tendai's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. This was the brother of Malik, the one Zuri had feared would come looking for her. The man who claimed her son as a part of his legacy. Jonah stepped forward, his presence filling the small entryway with an oppressive weight. Zuri's voice shook as she took another step back. "You have no right to be here, Jonah. Malik's gone. You have no claim to us." Jonah's gaze sharpened, his smile fading. "Malik may be gone, but his influence isn't. He left something valuable behind, a son, my nephew, and I intend to bring him into the family where he belongs." Tendai moved protectively in front of Zuri, his voice cold. "You're not taking anyone. This is her son, her life. You have no right to come here and threaten that." Jonah's eyes narrowed, the air between them crackling with tension. "You think you can protect her? You think you're any match for the network Malik and I built?" He took a step closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "The only reason you're standing here is because I allowed it." The words hung in the air, a threat and a challenge wrapped into one. Tendai clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the battle that lay ahead. But just as he opened his mouth to respond, Zuri stepped forward, her gaze fierce, her voice steady. "No, Jonah," she said, her tone defiant. "You don't get to control me anymore. You don't get to lay claim to my son, to our lives. Whatever power you think you have over me, it ends here. Jonah's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something colder, darker. But Zuri didn't back down, her voice growing stronger. I left Malik, I left that world, because I wanted something real, something built on love, not fear, and I'm not afraid of you anymore. Tendai felt a surge of pride as he watched her, standing tall, refusing to let the shadows of her past dictate her future. Jonah's expression hardened, but he seemed to recognize the determination in her eyes, the unbreakable bond she and Tendai shared. You're making a mistake, Zuri, Jonah said, his voice dangerously soft. You can't run from your blood, and you can't hide from what's coming. She met his gaze, unflinching. Watch me. With one last, scornful glance, Jonah turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows outside. Tendai closed the door, his hand trembling as he locked it. He turned to Zuri, pulling her into his arms, his voice a murmur against her hair. We'll face this, together. She nodded, burying her face against his chest, her body shaking as the weight of the confrontation settled over her. But as they held each other in the warmth of the kitchen, Tendai knew that they had found something stronger than fear. They had found a reason to stand, to fight, to reclaim their lives from the darkness. And as they stood there, the faint sound of Kofi's footsteps on the stairs broke the silence, a reminder of what they were fighting for, a future where love could conquer even the darkest of shadows.